Tous et à toutes, je m'appelle Zachary Peikin. Bienvenue à l'Institut pour la paix et la diplomatie. Welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Peikin. I am a researcher, a non-resident researcher, rather, at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, as well as a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all today for an extremely timely webinar. Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive appears to have finally begun, and its outcome may go a long way in determining the future of Western support for Ukraine and the course of the war more generally as well. How likely is the counteroffensive to succeed? Is this the beginning of the end of this war, or merely the end of the beginning? And now, with all eyes on the military dimension, what Western policies on the diplomatic track are most likely to bring about a cessation of hostilities in the months ahead? To answer these and many, many more questions, we are happy to welcome back to our platform three leading experts on the Russian military, on Russian foreign policy, and European security more broadly. Michael Kofman, you are director of the Russia Studies program at CNA and an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., or CNAS. It's a real pleasure to welcome you back to IPD. The last time we had you here was, I believe, just 2 days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So a pleasure to welcome you back and to benefit from your insights. Andrew Michta is Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Statecraft Center for Strategy and Security. Thank you so much for joining us again at IPD. And last but certainly not least is Anatol Lieven, who is director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in DC. Thank you, Anatol, for joining us again. Andrew, I would be remiss if we did not begin with the latest potential revelations before we get into the counteroffensive itself concerning the Nordstream pipelines. If it is indeed confirmed that Ukrainian saboteurs placed Europe's energy security at further risk on the eve of winter, I'm wondering, based on your knowledge of transatlantic security and partnerships, in your view, what would the consequences be for relations between Ukraine and the West?
Well, thank you for inviting me. And before I answer, let me state that I'm speaking in my private capacity as an analyst and not on behalf of the Marshall Center or the Defense Department. I'm here as an analyst and a scholar. As to your question, I do not see any major impact should these revelations, as you call them, prove to be true or were documented. For two reasons. I mean, I think we're now so far removed from the actual event. I don't think this would be a priority for European leadership. And secondly, you know, over these months, Europe has reoriented significantly when it comes to its energy supply and its overall relationship when it comes to these two pipelines. That I would not speculate that this would have a major impact on the Ukrainian relations with other European capitals.
Got it. Thank you. Anatol, this latest intelligence supposedly about the Nord Stream pipelines comes on top of other Ukrainian actions that stand perhaps to eat away at trust between Kiev and Western capitals. Ukraine has seemingly been involved in drone attacks and targeted assassinations on Russian territory against U.S. objections, and yet it has denied responsibility for these actions. Kiev also accused Moscow of firing a missile that landed on Polish territory last autumn, when in reality this was likely Ukraine's own air defenses. So what does this suggest about the likely level of trust between Ukraine and its Western partners, not just now, but also after the war has ended and we begin on the task of bringing Ukraine into Western institutions?
Well, first, one must say that the great majority of Ukrainian actions are, of course, entirely justifiable, both morally and legally. In response to the Russian invasion, Russian bombardment of targets, civilian targets in Ukraine, and so on. I mean, according to the laws of war, not when it comes to assassinations. No, that is a much more questionable issue. But certainly when it comes to attacks on Russian territory, Ukraine has the perfect right. Whether it is wise to do so, that is a different question. But certainly, as your question implied, I mean, what it does raise, if it is true, as we have heard from leaks from the Biden administration, that the Biden administration warned against attacks on Russian territory, that the CIA leaked that it had strongly opposed assassinations. Well, that does say something quite worrying about America's ability to influence or control the Ukrainian government. And of course, the loss of control by America or other great powers over client states, in which, well, you know, the old phrase wag the dog, is an old and somewhat worrying pattern. But I think you're also right to put your finger on what really, I think, in the long historical term, will be the key issue for Ukraine, which is not so much NATO membership, which I regard almost as an irrelevance now, because whatever happens, you know, Ukraine will be a close military partner of the West. But it is whether Ukraine can carry out, with Western help, the kind of reforms that would allow it to join the European Union and become a fully fledged member of the West. And for that, given that there are, you know, very, very difficult issues involved, as we have seen, for example, from the attempt by Poland to block Ukrainian grain exports. Poland is, of course, a very strong supporter of Ukraine, but not when it comes to damage to Polish farmers. And in these circumstances, you know, trust between Ukraine and its Western partners will be very important. And I think that this kind of action by the Ukrainians does not further that.
Got you. Thank you. Before we unpack a lot of those topics, let's just keep the focus on immediate, most recent news. Michael, if we could just talk about the latest news concerning the destruction of the Nova Kakhovka dam. Could you help our audience understand what strategic consequences this is likely to have for both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, and how it will impact the ability of both sides' forces to operate on the affected terrain?
So it's an economic, ecological, and humanitarian disaster in practice, right? It's going to dramatically affect that region, Kherson, both sides of the riverbank. It's going to also affect Crimea and the water supply to Crimea. It's already flooded and destroyed a number of communities. It's flooded Kherson city. It actually will affect the Russian controlled or occupied part of Kherson, the left riverbank, worse than the currently Ukrainian held one. It's already destroyed probably Russian positions along the riverbank, but it's also made a Ukrainian crossover operation exceedingly difficult and unlikely. That being said, it was always going to be a very difficult proposition to begin with, nor does anybody expect it to be the thrust or the main vector of any Ukrainian offensive, which is going to be on land rather than across the river. I think it's actually not going to substantially affect combat operations, meaning I don't think it's going to really shape Ukrainian military prospects in the offensive that's currently ongoing. It will create a major humanitarian problem for Ukraine to manage. It's also going to create a problem for the Russian sort of occupation authorities. The long-term consequences are difficult to discern, right? And I am no expert on environmental science to be able to discuss it here, but it's clearly a disaster. It's going to really substantially affect irrigation in the area because a lot of this is sort of agriculture that's supported by the canals that are channeled, that come as channels from the Dnieper River. In terms of military prospects and fortunes, I actually don't think it's going to have that significant impact, to be perfectly honest. I think I think that this is a case where, look, either way, obviously I don't know what happened, but Russia ultimately is responsible because either this was a deliberate act of destruction or the dam failed due to negligence and because it was previously damaged by Russian forces during their retreat from Kherson. But either way you look at it, the dam was under Russian control at the time that this happened. And there's already debates unfolding as to exactly what took place. Ukraine clearly is saying that Russia actually destroyed the dam, and this is a deliberate act. And that might well be the case.
Okay, excellent. Let's stick with you for a minute, Michael. Can we glean anything from Ukraine's goals in this counteroffensive from what we've seen so far, based on reports that their initial line of attack appears to have been a little bit further to the east than many experts expected?
Yeah, I don't know what basis expert uses to expect anything because I don't think any of them are in the Ukrainian general staff in the planning cell. So there's a lot of commentators and they have a lot of notional expectations as to what to happen. I've not been one of them. It's just much easier to see the offensive play out and then try to deduce what's happening on the basis of what you see taking place on the ground. So I had no specific expectations. The best I can do is say that based on the last several days of fighting, what we can say is that the Ukrainian offensive has begun. This is unlikely to be the main effort. I've only seen a very, very small percentage, perhaps one brigade from the sort of Western trained and equipped brigades involved in overall action. So most of the units one would have expected to see in the offensive have yet to come into play. That said, the visual evidence is quite lagging, so we have to assume that what we know, what we're seeing, is delayed by some period of time. At this stage, the initial thrust of the Ukrainian advance is between kind of Vuhledar and Velika Novosilka, which is in the southwestern part of Donetsk or along the border of Zaporizhia, but there's also been fighting in Zaporizhia. And there's an ongoing localized counterattack in around Bakhmut and at Soledar. So I think that's basically what's worth saying at this stage. As to where it's going, what its objectives are, I'm not going to speculate on it, but I do enjoy hearing the expectations of other folks.
Okay, excellent. If we could maybe frame the discussion a little bit, and perhaps this is a difficult thing to do, but Andrew, in your definition, what constitutes Ukrainian success in this counteroffensive?
Strategic outcome, that is a breakthrough that basically renders the Russian military that's currently on the front line combat ineffective. I think that would be a truly transformative outcome should it come to that. How likely is it? We could speculate. Would have to take into account not just the plans, this as Michael rightly pointed out, unless you're sitting inside the general staff. A lot of the stuff I see in the media from various analysts, they're just speculations. But I think that from the Ukrainian point of view, the political dimension of such a strategic breakthrough would be decisive in terms of both how the supporters of Ukraine would look at the prospect of this war unfolding forward. Anything short of that, I'm sure it will be a gain for Ukraine if Ukraine liberates more territory. We've raised, unfortunately, our expectations in the commentariat so high that I sometimes have a sense that those expectations have become unreasonable, and as though we were waiting for the war to end August 31st and then have a negotiation and the rest of it. I don't think we're tracking in that direction at all.
Well, Anatol, to pick up on that, if Ukraine does make gains, but short of these sky-high expectations, is that a success from Ukraine's point of view?
I think it's worth pointing out, again, I've pointed it out many times, that Ukraine, with our backing, has already achieved a transformative victory. Remember what Russian goals were when Russia launched this invasion. It was clearly to subjugate the whole of Ukraine and turn Ukraine again into a Russian client state, or failing that, to break off essentially half the country, and place it under some form of Russian rule. Now, both of those aims have been almost completely defeated. Well, the first totally defeated, and the second, Russia has gained part of 2 provinces. That's all in its, and additional part of the Donbass. Now this, whichever way you look at it, this is a huge defeat for Russia. But much more importantly, I think, even than this, is the fact that now, unless, of course, there is some internal upheaval in Ukraine or a collapse of the West, for God forbid, by far the greater part of Ukraine will now be fully independent of Russia and aligned with the West, certainly militarily aligned and economically, as far as it is in Ukraine's ability to do and in our ability to support that. Now, this is a transformative victory in terms of the dominant pattern of almost 400 years of Ukrainian and Russian history, in which Ukraine has either been subordinate to Russia or, of course, under the Russian Empire, simply part of Russia. So I think, first it's worth pointing this out, that, we've already scored well, the Ukrainians with our help have scored a great victory. Whatever now happens on the ground, and I do not myself believe that a full Russian victory in Ukraine is remotely possible now, barring, as I say, a collapse not just of Ukraine but of the West as well. Where we go from here, the Ukrainian government has defined victory as the complete recovery of all Ukrainian territory lost since 2014. As far as, and has said that this is non-negotiable, the Biden administration has sent mixed signals on this at different points and from different people. As far as Russia is concerned, the surrender of Crimea, at least, probably the Eastern Donbass as well, but certainly Crimea, is absolutely non-negotiable. So we have to see what happens on the battlefield, but we also, of course, have to see what attitude in the end Ukraine's Western backers will take, or a majority of them, and especially, and of course, above all, the United States. Whether the US is in fact committed to a total Ukrainian victory as defined by Ukraine, or is prepared to settle for at least provisionally, a more qualified victory. I should say, by the way, that I regard an actual formal peace settlement as impossible for the foreseeable future, because the two sides are too far apart. So what we would be aiming at, as in other more or less melancholy, but at least not disastrous other cases in the world in recent decades, would be a more or less stable ceasefire.
Okay, let's stick with the military dynamics for just a second and bring Michael back into the conversation. I'm wondering, Michael, based on your understanding of military strategy, military tactics, military history, whether a situation like the one we're seeing unfold right now generally favors the attacker or the defender. And perhaps you can help us to understand that a little bit with what we're seeing unfold right now. For example, these initial Ukrainian attacks, perhaps serving to attempt to create weaknesses in Russia's defenses, to stretch Russia's units thin, attacking multiple areas of the front at once. But even if that works at first, how much will the physical infrastructure that Russia has erected over the past many months slow down Ukraine's stronger units in any subsequent attack? How much is the terrain really tilted towards the defender at this point in time?
Okay, well, land warfare always favors the defender by definition. Sorry. So that's a very easy answer. And the attacking side usually has to establish either a significant quantitative or qualitative advantage in order to break through. Does Ukraine have that? Yes, because the front line is quite large. The number of Russian forces in Ukraine and the quality of those forces isn't particularly good, and the number is probably not sufficient to man large parts of that line. That said, the Russian military has several lines of defense in the south. Probably has more like one line of defense in the northeast and Luhansk. So it all depends. So Zach, I wish I was party to the Ukrainian plans and I knew the correlation of forces. And I knew everything that was going to happen. And I could give you a very good answer. But I'm not party to any of that. And so the honest answer is it really depends on a lot of things, right? The job of a defensive line is not to stop an opposing force. It's not a wall, not a magical force barrier. It's designed to attrition them and canalize their advance, okay? And it's designed to degrade them in order to improve the correlation of forces for the defending force over time and to impose difficulties for them. Does that exist when we look at Russian entrenchments and fortifications? Yes, it does. Does the Ukrainian military have substantial additional force capacity to conduct an offensive? Yes, they do. And they have a qualitative advantage as well. And they obviously have an advantage in all the soft factors, the intangibles, in terms of motivation, leadership, and what have you, which is an analyst we cannot rate. That's why we call them intangibles. If we could count them the way we count tanks, they would be tangibles. But be that what it may, Ukraine clearly has other advantages that we have to take into account. So how does this reconcile? At least from my point of view, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I've actually become more optimistic over the last 2 months, both because the Ukrainian military has had greater time to train and equip their forces. They've waited much better, so to speak, for the weather to improve. And I think the Russian military in many ways is sort of off in a bad way in terms of the state and conditions of the force, right? But that is not predictive of outcomes. That's just sort of the nature of war. So that's the best I can do for you in answering that question.
Gotcha. Anatol, you wanted to jump in?
I just want to say that when I was in Ukraine in March, I had the chance to talk to quite a lot of soldiers, including several wounded soldiers on the Ukrainian side. And what every one of them talked about mines as a very important factor. And I'm afraid that several of them had missing legs to prove that, having trodden on mines. And they all said that the battlefield around Bakhmut, for example, is absolutely packed with mines by both sides. Of course, mines do have a great effect in slowing down the battlefield on both sides. How important they will be, in this coming campaign, we don't know. But certainly they've been very important in the fighting in the Donbass.
Could I, Zach, could I
Yes.
just comment on a couple of things? First, on Anatol's point that Ukraine has already scored a great victory, and that in effect, what will happen going forward is going to preserve that kind of outcome that we have already seen, if I understand Anatol correctly. I am not as certain. This is an unfolding battle. This is an unfolding campaign. We have a tendency, I think, if you look at how it unfolded, first, we both underestimated the Ukrainians tremendously and overestimated the Russians. When the Kiev battle was fought, again, the linear projection was, oh, the Russians are really incompetent and incapable. Then the Russians took a big hammer and drew them into a war of attrition. And that is destroying both human and weapons and munitions kind of assets on both sides. It's not only on the Russian side. So I am not sure that we are seeing even the framing of the final settlement. And I'm here with Michael on the key point, without even knowing what the conditions are, what the plans are. It seems that the current situation seems to favor the Ukrainian side if it can indeed break through the lines. The question that will remain is, can they actually effectively maneuver? Can they use deep strikes effectively? Can they exploit and capitalize on any sort of potential breakthrough? I think that is something we simply do not know, because we also do not know the actual conditions of both armies. We have some assessments. There are a lot of them in the open source materials, but we don't really know until this unfolds into this decisive engagement, how far it's likely to go. And assuming that the Ukrainians can break through, can this be a strategic victory on the battlefield or just an operational game?
Well, Andrew, can I? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anatol.
That applies the other way around as well. I mean, we cannot say for sure what the quality of the Russian army is now when it comes to maneuvering. What we do know is that they have performed abysmally very often to date at the beginning, but we haven't seen evidence since then of, well, certainly not in terms of military successes, of vast improvement.
Well, we haven't, but at the same time, there's. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, but also, if you listen to Mr. Prigozhin, not of course a neutral source, but you'll certainly hear some very strong and I would say in general, justified criticisms of the entire quality of the Russian high command to this day.
Okay, let me jump back in here because, Andrew, let me just jump back in and then I'll come back to both Anatol and you with a couple of questions afterwards. But Michael, I just want to pick up on something that Anatol just said right now about Prigozhin. I'm wondering if you can help the audience understand actually a little bit about the dynamics of this continued infighting between Wagner forces and the Russian military brass, because this looks like this is becoming more than just a PR campaign. Tensions are beginning, it seems at least, to spill over onto the battlefield itself, inebriation or otherwise. So, I mean, can you help us understand how this is going to affect Russia's defensive capabilities, its defensive strategy, its ability to preserve its territorial gains in the face of pressure?
Okay, I mean, this has been going on for quite some time. If you don't know who Prigozhin is at this point, then I don't know what news you've been reading over the past year, to be perfectly honest. So there's not much new from my point of view in this story. Wagner grew to prominence since May of last year in this war. They became essential in the battle for Bakhmut. Them fighting for Bakhmut created a bit of a fixing effect in terms of taking that battle out of being a sideshow and becoming the main battle over the course of the winter, just because there wasn't much else going on besides the fighting outside of Crimea. Okay, they have a whole host of disputes with the Russian military, right? There's a competition both at the senior level and the forces to test each other. So there's no unity of effort and no unity of command. It's a very variegated force. It's localized to Bakhmut. It's really important people understand that Ukraine's a big country and Bakhmut is one battle in it. It's actually not that big of a battle, right? The reason I say this is people confuse the Battle of Bakhmut for the Russian winter offensive. Oftentimes there's not a lot of clarity as to where things are, right? So let me just lay these points on the table. One, the dispute between Russia military and Wagner is centralized around Bakhmut. Wagner has since begun withdrawing from Bakhmut. Doesn't actually have any relationship to what's happening to Zaporizhia or in the south of Donetsk or necessarily in Luhansk, okay? Wagner was never a force that was going to be defending in these areas. In fact, having taken Bakhmut and then withdrawn from it, the Russian military is now forced to pull units from these other areas and fix them around Bakhmut to defend against a localized Ukrainian counterattack. What Wagner's going to do now, I don't know. I have no idea, all right? How important is Prigozhin to all of this? Clearly has political ambitions. On the one hand, he's protected on the top. On the other hand, it's very obvious that he needs to engage in theatrics and these videos because he doesn't actually have direct access to Vladimir Putin. If he did, you just call him, he has problems resolved, okay? I'm not a Kremlinologist. I do not know what's going on between Prigozhin and Shoigu and Gerasimov, and I haven't heard a lot of people that do. So I can't tell you this, the back of the story. I think it very much is what it looks like, right? That's my personal interpretation of it.
Understood. Okay, let's turn back to Andrew and start to look ahead a little bit, because Anatol mentioned in a previous response that Ukraine has already scored a significant strategic victory. But let's sort of play this out hypothetically. Let's say that Ukraine's counteroffensive largely fails with marginal territorial gains, heavy losses of troops and equipment. What happens then? Is that still a strategic victory for Ukraine? Because is it possible in a scenario like that Russia will try to press its advantage on the battlefield? And is there a way we could coax them perhaps to the negotiating table to avoid something like that?
Well, let me answer this by kind of unpacking this a little bit. So such an outcome would register differently, I believe, in Ukraine and differently in the West. You have seen that when Ukraine scores battlefield successes, support firms up. And so any sort of setback on the battlefield, I think, would register in a negative way. I do not believe, however, that the Ukrainians would consider that, kind of an end point at which they have to go to the negotiation table. I think the level of determination on the part of the Ukrainian people and its leadership would simply mean that they are trying to engage yet again. So that's the first part. As to the end game, look, Anatol brought up the conditionality of EU membership, and a lot of the conversation, I'm in Germany here, in Europe is focusing on that rather than the military dimension. The fact is that unless the security question is addressed, that is that Ukraine either enters the alliance or has some form of security guarantee from the West or whatever, all the talk about reconstructing Ukraine and EU membership is largely academic, because if you think of private equity investments, not just government funds, going into a country that's constantly under threat of destruction, that's a purely hypothetical conversation. So the first order would have to be, whatever the outcome of this offensive, is to have a real plan with tangible steps going forward of how Ukraine's security will be provided for. And mind you, this includes also the cost of reconstruction, factoring in the cost of maintaining the military capable enough, strong enough to deter and, if need be, to defend against another Russian attack. And the way the current Ukrainian military is structured is really unsustainable in peacetime. If you look at the variety of equipment, hodgepodge of systems that they're operating and all of that. So regardless of how this offensive unfolds, and I agree with Michael that speculating about this gets us only so far. I don't see any sort of end game regardless of whether the Ukrainians score a strategic breakthrough or not, simply because at this point, Putin is not ready to negotiate. He has doubled down, as you have seen, after he failed in this kind of blitzkrieg formula. And I think the Russians believe that, considering just the size and population differential, they're in a stronger position. Ukraine today, by different estimates, has between 27 to 29 million people left in the country. You know, when it started this war, correct me, Anatol, if I'm wrong, there's over 40 million. When Ukraine became free, it was over 50 million. So they're at about 1/4 of the Russian population. So Ukraine, to fight this war, it has to fight it on its own terms, smartly. It needs to maneuver, use deep strikes. If it stays in the war of attrition kind of a formula that the Russians are trying to impose, then there will be at a disadvantage.
Gotcha. If you'll allow me to, sorry, Anatol, go ahead.
Yeah, though I draw your attention to what I at least found very interesting remarks by Margarita Simonian, whose name will be known to you, who is a journalist, but very much a Kremlin spokeswoman, over the weekend, in which she welcomed the Indonesian peace proposal and said, basically, we should settle for what we've got. We should accept a ceasefire along the present, front line, and we should accept UN-supervised referenda in the areas that we have taken. I think it highly unlikely, knowing her position, that she would have said that without, encouragement from the top. My point is that we do not know what Putin would be willing to negotiate about, because he at least has not stated his final, or Russia's final, negotiating position. We know what Russia will not negotiate about, which is certainly the loss of Crimea. But the point is, if we're talking about bringing Russia to the negotiating table, as still most of the time is the language of the Biden administration and of most European countries, then the question is, negotiate about what? If the aim is complete Russian defeat, then there is nothing to negotiate about. So we keep coming back to the question of whether there can be some kind of provisional, only provisional, of course, ceasefire involving a provisional territorial compromise. You can't get away from that fundamental question.
Zach, could I just have a two-finger intervention here? My position is, I'm bringing these kind of concerns and trying to articulate this, not because I believe that the Russians are not exhausted, far from it. If you look at the condition of the Russian military, the land forces, not the air force, both strategic and tactical, are barely touched, virtually untouched, and so is the Navy. But the land forces have taken a horrendous beating. So on the one hand, I think Ukraine is well positioned to launch the kind of strategic breakthrough, and if they can exploit it, they can get to a very advantageous position very, very soon. Having said that, the Russians have demonstrated that they can both fight and mobilize, right? And we tend to look at the performance of the Russian military from the perspective of the atrocious performance, especially the logistics and leadership and the rest of it. Clearly, the Ukrainians have superior morale. They're better trained. They're better led. But my point is, the Russians may be counting on stretching this out as long as they can, believing that in terms of just the stocks of weapons, the biggest question that we have is, how quickly would it take the Russians to rebuild their land forces? That is something that I've been asking myself over time. So even if there is some sort of a ceasefire that Anatol suggested, I don't think that will be the end of this conflict. I think Putin would use this as a breather to refurbish, rebuild, and then he would re-engage. And at a time when we don't know what the overall global situation would be, Western focus, what would be happening on the Indo-Pacific front.
Well, this is where I think Michael's insight.
Equally the other way around. Ukraine would also use a ceasefire to rearm, build up its forces. So no ceasefire can be permanently guaranteed either way around.
Okay, let's focus on Russia for just 1 second. I want to bring Michael back into the conversation because this does sort of build on what Andrew just said. How long can Russia keep fighting this war if it so chooses? Even if it loses everything it has gained since February of last year, does it still have the ability to make Ukrainians' lives exceedingly difficult, even if the West continues to increase the sanctions pressure against the Russian economy and defense industry?
Okay, that's slightly two different questions. How long can Russia continue fighting this war? If you're asking about economic potential and resources, for quite a few years. All right, there are structural problems if you look at the overall cap on energy derived revenue from the government and the high expenditure on this war, but they can certainly sustain it for several years in the medium term. All right, that said, most answers to the question of how long can a country continue the war are based on extrapolation of where you are, and they always suffer from strong status quo bias, which is wars proceed in phases. You don't know what the war is going to look like next year and what it's going to involve. You don't know whether Russian military will face a catastrophic defeat over the course of the next 3 months, right? So it's a bit of an abstraction. The second question that's kind of embedded in what you asked me, if Ukraine liberates all the territory, can the war continue? Well, obviously it can. It's a cross-border war of attrition. Many wars have continued in this manner. Is that a much better problem for Ukraine to have, a war where it's actually retaken control of a lot of its territory, and now the war is a cross-border conflict? Yes, it definitely is. It's a better scenario. But it's important to disambiguate the question of military victory from the question of political victory, right? Unfortunately, it's up to the loser typically to decide when the war is over and to hand you a political victory. And the third one is war termination, which is the war can go on in various phases. And this is also why the proposition of an early ceasefire is illusory, because it can often lead to a rearmament period, and all you'll get is a continuation war. In fact, this war in practice is a continuation war of the initial 2014 war. That's all it is, right? And many wars follow in series like these. You can look around to Arab-Israeli conflicts, India and Pakistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I hate to be pessimistic here, but they often do go in series, even if you have a prolonged ceasefire. And yes, the war can well continue as a war of attrition, although there's obviously a much better conflict in terms of Ukraine's ability to manage it, and the net balance favors Ukraine once it's regained control of a lot of its territory.
Okay, Andrew, if Russia does...
On the subject of India and Pakistan, I've been covering the conflict in Kashmir for almost 40 years, God help me. And I mean, I think the point is that, of course, the ceasefire there has been highly imperfect, and it's been interrupted by periodic episodes of violence and a couple of full-scale wars. But still, it isn't solved today, but the fact that you do not have permanent full-scale fighting between India and Pakistan with tens of thousands of deaths each year does make a very, very big difference. So, even bad ceasefires do count for something.
Michael, you want to come back at that?
I think Anatol's right, and I'm not sure whether the 40-year duration of India-Pakistan wars is an optimistic or a pessimistic projection for where we are, based on the start of this being in 2014. But I think the challenge is that after around 2017, the rate of fighting between Russia and Ukraine along the line of contact in the occupied territories of Donbass very much went down to about what you would get between India and Pakistan. If you look at the casualties on both sides, they're quite low. But this can then give you a false sense that you have frozen the conflict, right? And what actually happens is that none of the fundamental issues are resolved. And then eventually over time, one side decides that it has the opportunity or the need or is deeply optimistic about its military prospects and will engage in a war of a much larger scale. And we saw that between Armenia and Azerbaijan, right? We could confidently say that after the initial fighting, I think in 92 and 94, that actually this conflict was relatively frozen until, let's say, the brief fighting in 2016, and then back again between, let's say, 2016 and 2020. And then we saw a large-scale conventional conflict that actually substantially reversed the situation post-1990. Sorry to get into the story, which is, I agree with Anatol, which is history can lead us to different conclusions depending on how we interpret that data.
Could I just make one comment about how Ukrainian side would also be rearming and refitting. Let's remember that the condition of the defense industry across the West, which has been substantially reduced over the last 30 years as a result of a series of policy decisions, has created a situation that to some extent, we're in a numbers game situation. It's not just a question of political will, it's what's available in terms of the rates of ammunition production, missile production, weapons production, the number of companies and lead times for deliveries. So unless, if we envision this kind of protracted, multiple year going war, then there will be some very serious decisions that will have to be made on the Western side when it comes to our defense industrial base. All of our assessments of ammunitions expenditures that we had, the whole culture of just in case deliveries, operating with, secure logistic chains and all of that we lived with during the so-called global war on terror, this is all went out the window. So if we're envisioning, that kind of protracted conflict, then we also have to ask some very serious questions on the Western side, because Ukraine is not capable of continuing that without Western military supplies and money just to function. Country has lost about 40% of its GDP right now, and it's being systematically destroyed, right? So this would have to be a long-term commitment on the side of the West. That's why I think it's important for Ukraine to actually reach that strategic breakthrough as soon as possible, if it is to be able to defend its territory effectively.
Okay, I want to leave some time for audience questions. So I think this discussion about mutual deterrence between Russia and Ukraine is a good segue into the question of mutual security guarantees. So Andrew, can I just stick with you for a second? Bringing about an end game to this phase of hostilities, at least, is likely going to require some kind of Western security guarantee or assurance for Ukraine. A lot of people have their eyes peeled to see what happens in Vilnius next month. A lot of people are saying this won't rise to the level of Article 5, given that Western countries are not currently prepared to send their own troops to fight for Ukraine, but nonetheless, it will be some substantial upgrading of the relationship between NATO and Ukraine. But let's game this out for a second. Let's imagine Vladimir Putin stays in power or is replaced by someone from inside the regime. In order to make sure that Russia is not a perennial security threat to the West, do we also, in this scenario, where we provide Ukraine a security guarantee, do we also need to talk about security guarantees of some kind for Russia, or at least some kind of new deal agreed between Russia and the West?
I wouldn't go there. I don't think there's any sort of near-term prospect of some deal and security guarantees mutually. I don't buy the argument that the conflict was triggered by Russia's growing sense of insecurity. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship out there where people claim that because NATO was enlarging, Russia had to move into Ukraine, that Russia warned this. Putin is relitigating 1991. This is, maybe the final or second to the final battle of the Cold War. The question is larger in my view. What happens between now and Vilnius will be, in my opinion, critical to regional security in Europe and globally. These two theaters, the Ukrainian theater and what's brewing in the Indo-Pacific, are interconnected. I mean, basically, the Chinese and the Russians have created a two-frontier crisis for us. And it's only because the Ukrainians stood up that this is now being dismantled, and we can talk about sequencing of potential confrontations. So what has to happen, in my view, in the region? We have to think not in terms of one country solutions, but in terms of region-wide security solution. There's a touch of unreality when people talk about, whether Ukraine can, should, would be a full NATO member. I have argued from the beginning that full NATO membership for Ukraine is the best way to actually ensure security in the region, and it will have tremendous consequences also for Belarus and for regional security writ large. The Finns and the Swedes made a very clear call saying, there's no security below the threshold of Article 5. You need to be a full member. Any sort of partnership deals don't work. And so right now we're kind of talking in between full membership and some sort of a security guarantee, provided by whom? Then, of course, the United States has brought in countries like Poland, like the Scandinavians, and all of that. I think that is a partial solution. If we cannot have a conversation in Vilnius about full membership in NATO for Ukraine, we should have a very specific set of timelines, steps to be taken, conditions for Ukraine, and an end date when this process would complete. I am afraid anything short of that will simply keep us in this protracted area of instability. Last comment, Zach. We can see so far that NATO line, NATO membership has been deterring Putin from trying to take that conflict outside of NATO boundaries. And I think that should be a good lesson for us.
So just to summarize, when it comes to our approach with Russia, we need deterrence, maybe dialogue, but no new deal that would fundamentally reshape new sort of sets of expectations about reciprocal behavior and the like that somehow addresses Russia's declared security concerns.
I would say dialogue about what with Russia at this point. That's why I'm very skeptical about all these plans. Let's have a dialogue. Let's remember that Putin is effectively an indicted international criminal. So the idea that we're somehow sitting at the table now and having a conversation with him, it would be a very hard sell. There's also something called the public opinion in democracies that would play a role here.
Okay, Anatol.
Look, I mean, when it comes to international criminality, and international opinion, by the way, I mean, do recall that a large majority of countries around the world do not accept the moral right of the West to dictate to them on the subject of morality, because they have observed our own behavior and that of the United States in their own regions very closely over the years. So, I mean, that is a point to be made. Of course, when it comes to trials for violations of international law, that is a bad precedent for America to set, given some of its own past behavior. And in the end, you deal with the foreign governments you have, or they have, not the ones that you would wish. And the other way around as well. Anyone who suggested that the rest of the world should tear up agreements with the United States or refuse to talk to the United States because they despise the administration of Donald Trump would have been offending against basic principles of international order. So that's the first point to be made about this. On the wider point, I agree that there is no possibility of a new security architecture involving Russia. But as far as NATO membership is concerned, look, our governments, and on this they are backed by the great majority of their peoples, according to opinion polls, have said again and again and again that they will not send their own troops to defend Ukraine. In these circumstances, NATO membership is irrelevant. It's fantastical. In fact, all it is an opportunity, if it happened, for Russia to humiliate us by attacking Ukraine and then saying, so, what are you going to do about it? There are, of course, security guarantees short of that, which to a considerable extent we've already fulfilled in terms of massive military aid to Ukraine. But, let us not deceive ourselves. I don't know about Poland, perhaps, maybe Britain, maybe the United States. But the chances that Germany or France or Denmark or Holland will ever send their troops to fight Russia in Ukraine or anywhere else is zero. Zero. They will do so if Russia attacks them, but Russia has no intention of attacking them. So let's be honest about ourselves. We are not going to defend Ukraine with our own lives. And at that point, offering Ukraine NATO membership is empty, frankly.
Okay, so Andrew, let's throw Anatol's point back at you. I mean, on the one point, yes, Western countries are not prepared to fight for Ukraine, but as you said before, if we don't offer Ukraine some kind of security guarantee or some sort of inclusion in the European security architecture or the Western security architecture, as it were, then we have a security black hole, effectively, that may lead to a vicious cycle of escalation and violence that's difficult to control. So how do you square that circle?
Zach, the two-finger on the question of international criminality. I understood your question to be about the West negotiating with Russia and not the international community, global South, and the rest of it. So let's set that aside. I will not be debating, the United States in the international context or the rest of it. My point is that we have a critical decision to make when it comes to the security architecture of the region. This is Eastern Europe historically. If you look at the last major conflicts, right? This is the crush zone. This is an area where Russian imperial expansion has once again moved in the direction of the West. Whether or not the NATO as a whole would fight should Ukraine be a member of NATO, I am not as certain as Anatol is that the Germans or the Dutch or the French would not engage if the alliance were under attack. But I will make this point. I agree with Anatol that there is a visible regionalization of security optics across NATO. If you're in a flank country, if you go to Finland, if you go to Latvia, if you go to Poland or Romania, there's a very keen sense of threat, danger, and determination to help. When you start traveling west, it becomes less so. If you're in Berlin, it's more bidirectional kind of. If you're in Paris, it's very much also focused on the southern direction, on the Mediterranean and Africa. But these are internal dynamics inside the alliance, because there's no clearly articulated consensus on the extent of threat perception. NATO is unified politically, but it's got a very different level of appetite for risk-taking as you move farther from the flank. Having said that, we do not know how this war will be unfolding going forward, or even how Russia will then behave vis-a-vis the West. So I think making definitive statements about that Ukraine in NATO would mean that NATO would not come to its assistance should it be the full member, I would be more cautious than making these statements.
Okay, can I just ask one question of clarification, which is that people can quibble about the origins and the causes of this war. You can talk about NATO expansion and Russian security concerns. You can talk about Russian imperialism and the fact that it wants to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence as some kind of vassal. But whether it's one or the other, basically, Russia is not prepared to countenance Ukraine being part of the West. That's why it launched this war. So is any kind of security guarantee offered by the West something that Russia will be prepared to accept? And if not, are we not going to be continuing a spiral of violence?
But you just said that Russia is determined to vassalize, control, and what have you when it comes to Ukraine. So there's a contradiction here. I mean, is there a security guarantee we can offer to Ukraine while Russia remains on this path? I think nothing short of NATO membership is actually meeting that standard. And let's also remember another thing. Ukraine is a large country. Its military is now the strongest military in Europe. It has demonstrated, and I think to a large extent, it is fighting not just for its own survival, but it's blunting, it's dismantling the Russian force, especially its land forces. It's buying us time to rearm. All these things need to be. The larger question is, what kind of a security architecture do you imagine it to have in Europe? The Cold War ended, and this great flowering of democracy was largely possible because Russia was physically expelled from Central Europe. I mean, it was literally the troops moved out. That opened up the space for these countries to become democracies, to anchor in the West. And I think we're facing now a very fundamental question about what kind of a security architecture do we want to have there. Think for a minute, impact on Belarus. I mean, when I was watching the young men and women in Belarus being beaten during the demonstrations when the election was stolen, this tells me something. There's a national identity rising in Belarus that 3 decades of independent statehoods, no matter under what conditions and how run and what have you, but these things have consequences. And I think if Ukraine wins this war, and I think it has a very strong opportunity to do so, and successfully rebuilds, anchored in the NATO structures, I cannot imagine that Belarus would remain in its present condition for much longer after that.
Okay, quick two-finger
Sorry,
from
can
Anatol.
we be minimally realistic here? If Russia cannot take Kharkiv, less than 20 miles from the Russian border, the idea of a Russian conventional threat to NATO is absurd. I mean, there are other things Russia can do in terms of sabotage, cyber attacks, maybe attacks in space. But the idea of a Russian conventional attack on NATO, which, by the way, Russia has never threatened. There is no Russian threat to Finland. Russia has never threatened to attack Finland in recent decades. I mean, what have the victories so far been for if they have not demonstrated that the Russian ground force, well, not just the ground forces, I was under Russian bombardment for 8 days in Zaporizhia. The Russian missiles as well are a paper tiger. Of course, they're a threat to Ukraine, but the idea of an attack on NATO, it's ridiculous. I'm sorry.
Okay, but Anatol, if Russia does somehow, on whatever timetable, turn the tables in this war and find some sort of way to achieve a victory, does that not embolden it? Does it not allow it to rebuild? Does it not allow it to start causing problems right on the EU's border, on NATO's border, and threaten the security of NATO states?
Look, you are assuming that Russia has some innate genetic will to attack all its neighbors, irrespective of any other reality. The war in Ukraine, which frankly everyone who is actually a serious expert and is willing to talk honestly about this knows, for deep historical, ethnic, cultural, strategic reasons, is about Ukraine. It's not a threat to Poland, let alone Germany or France. And as for the further future, look, if you want to eliminate Russia for all time, in all circumstances, as a potential threat to its neighbors in the West, you have to not defeat Russia in Ukraine, you have to destroy Russia as a state. That is the only thing you can do if that is your permanent goal. Well, I mean, as several US presidents said, you do not do that to a nuclear power unless, in the words of President Kennedy, you have a collective death wish for mankind.
Okay, we're running out of time here, and I want to bring Michael back into the conversation for one last remark, just to leave our audience with some food for thought, because many analysts and commentators have suggested that this counteroffensive is likely to be the high watermark of Western military support for Ukraine, especially if it does not succeed. So what will happen to Ukraine's armed forces if today represents that high watermark? And how can you, if you can, could you connect it somehow to this discussion we've been having about the security architecture of the balance of power in Europe as well? If Ukraine is not able to be transformed into an effective bulwark from a strategic perspective between existing NATO members and Russia?
Sure. So I think that the West is actually in a much better position today compared to last year to sustain Ukraine's war effort. The matter in question is whether or not it can provide decisive advantage to the Ukrainian military after this offensive. And the answer is probably yes, but this could well be the high watermark of military assistance. But it's important not to then conflate that with the assumption that Western military assistance won't continue. In fact, there have already been announcements for Q3 and Q4 this year. Just not clear if a brigade-sized package with 9 brigades and a lot of artillery ammunition, what have you, can be assembled in this manner again. But it might not have to be to establish a substantial advantage over the Russian forces. So the honest answer is all depends, right? Depends on the collective action of Western countries and their interpretation of whether or not Ukraine is actually successful in this operation. That's why I said in my earlier comments that this is in part a proof of concept, right? So it's a bit of a Schrodinger's cat question, right? It will be the high watermark of Western military assistance if it is. But beyond that, I'm not sure how that connected to the discussion Andrew and Anatol were having. It's clear that the West does have the capacity to sustain a fairly robust Ukrainian military, right? It's clear that Ukraine will continue to have a fairly capable armed force. That military will obviously not look the way it does today because it's a mobilized military for an existential battle, and it's not the kind of military that a country can sustain in peacetime, nor would it necessarily have to. The Russian military is probably obviously not going to look the way it does today either, and it'll take Russia some time to reconstitute military power. I think at least the better part of a decade, if not longer, but it all depends. That said, the decade is actually a very short amount of time. In defense planning, a decade is often the narrowest timeline on which we do a lot of defense analysis. So 10 years can come and go pretty quickly when you think about it from a defense strategy perspective. But yeah, a lot of it depends on also how Ukraine is enmeshed or embedded into Western security structures, whether it's via NATO, whether it's via different set of security arrangements with the United States. It's clear that for Ukraine, priority number one is to develop a security relationship that has some sort of commitments or guarantees with the United States, right? No offense to Portugal or to other countries that may be in NATO. It's very clear if you're on Russia's borders and on this flank of NATO, who you want to have a security relationship with and who you would like to have commitments from. Yeah, that's quite obvious. And I personally, well, I won't say I don't have a dog in this fight, but I have my own views. But I think we already had a great discussion between Anatol and Andrew as to what the best way to make those arrangements happen. I think either way, you're not going to get around Ukraine having to have a fairly sizable military disc capable of deterring Russia and defending its borders, whether it's in NATO, not in NATO. And we have seen just being in NATO by itself does not absolve us of the need to have a capable force posture with combat credible forces in the Baltics and Poland and other countries, right? So NATO is kind of a necessary but not sufficient requirement. You still actually have to invest a lot in deterrence and defense and all these other things. And so with that regard, I actually do think Ukraine has a strong argument that it would contribute a lot more to NATO than certainly, or at least contribute a great deal to NATO compared to other countries, right? And it would be potentially down the line a positive addition. You can analogous to maybe to Finland, which brings substantial defense military capability to the alliance. I'll leave it at that. I think this has been a wonderful discussion.
Excellent. Lots of food for thought there. Thank you all so much. Indeed, it has been an excellent discussion. I really appreciate all of you sharing your frank and original thoughts on this matter. A special thanks to Andrew Michta for joining us on such short notice. We really appreciate you being part of the panel as well. For those questions we were not able to get to, and indeed we could have continued this discussion for a long time, but please do send them to info@peacediplomacy.org and we'll forward them to the relevant panelists. Otherwise, please do follow our activities at peacediplomacy.org. IPD especially wants to thank the Department of National Defense of Canada's Minds program, as well as the Stand Together Trust in Washington, D.C. for their support of all of our activities related to the war in Ukraine and European security more broadly. Thank you again to the three of you for a really, really excellent discussion. We hope to host you at IPD again. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. We'll see you next time. До свидания.
Thanks a lot.
До победы.